Senator, I think it's important to note that you've got a head of PREPA, Mr. Ramos, who has been on the job since March of this year. You indicated. I understand that there's been a significant turnover with the PREPA board. The most tenured member has been in place now for just 11 months. We have the Energy Commission as a new regulatory body that has been stood up. You've got the oversight board that just came on with PROMESA, and oh, by the way, let's just throw in 2 hurricanes into the mix as they're trying to deal with all of this, making a very hard situation, I think, even much more complicated and just really hard. Mr. Reimer, I want to ask just one question of you, sir. We don't want to leave the Virgin Islands out of these discussions. And I will tell you, and I know that Senator Franken saw the same thing when we were there on our trip, there's been so much attention focused on Puerto Rico that I kind of assumed that the Virgin Islands were doing just fine and perhaps the damage had not been as substantial. And then we get there and see the facts on the ground, and it's just a true reminder that just because we have moved to another disaster on another island doesn't mean that the Virgin Islands is all well. The governor has indicated that during his tenure, 5 hurricanes have gone through an opportunity, if you will, to have to deal with a rebuild of the grid 5 different times. Surely you learn from each successive disaster, and that effort to, quote, harden the grid is there with each rebuild. To what extent has the U.S. Virgin Islands been able to harden the grid from successive disasters to allow for greater resilience?
Over the several years, we've been able to basically tap hazard mitigation funds, and that's where we have underground systems that actually generate basically power to about 75 to 80% of our businesses within our commercial districts on St. Thomas and St. Croix. And that's what we've been doing since each storm, that we try to learn from each lesson learned. How do we underground? How do we become more resilient? And that's what we're doing now in terms of microgrids, going towards basically composite poles, et cetera, to make sure that in the next storm, is less damage, not as much damage, or little to no damage, such as we have enclosed all of our substations in concrete buildings. So there was no damage on our substations territory-wide. So that made it where there's no damage. In the past, we would have had damage on the actual substations. Now we have 0% damage on those. So with each storm and each successive storm, we learn and we get more resilient.
I'm told that Senator Lee is on his way back, so I'm going to ask another question until he arrives. Secretary Walker mentioned, and we saw a picture of some of the transmission lines that were just loaded with almost a jungle of fiber optics. He and I had an opportunity for conversation as we were coming back from our visit to both Puerto Rico and USVI. And he indicated that this was something that Department of Energy was going to be looking at in terms of does that increase vulnerability to additional damage. Mr. Ramos, have you looked at this aspect, those lines that were carrying kind of a jumble, if you will, of fiber optics? Are you seeing some evidence that perhaps this may be something that we need to address and change going forward?
Certainly. Many of the fallen poles and fell because of the additional weight of infrastructure that originally was not supposed to be there. So the grid itself is old. Our new design standards account for an amount of additional infrastructure for communications and other But many of the poles were, they had communications because some local law of Puerto Rico permitted the common right-of-way usage. So we had to allow, telecom companies to put the telecommunications cables there, but the pole itself not necessarily was designed to those standards. The new standards in PREPA, prior to Maria or the hurricanes, they've been in place for some years now, do include so that people can put, companies can put additional infrastructure. Puerto Rico, as you know, is, even though we've lost so many people, going out of the island, it's still, the metro areas are highly populated. It is very difficult, and I understand the situation, for other infrastructure to get a space other than the PREPA pole. But it's something that needs to be revisited. Everything relies on PREPA. All of the other infrastructure relies on PREPA, but they need also to invest in their systems, let's say telecommunications, for example, in order to provide a excellent service.
Yeah, well, it was a new issue that had been raised with me, and one that I think is important to look at, and one that I understand was not at issue in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which makes it, again, an interesting comparison there. Mr. Ramon, a question to you about the Energy Commission. I noted that it's a relatively new regulatory body. In terms of your ability to gain operational capacity, what is it that is needed within the Energy Commission to support what it is that you need to do?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Definitely the Commission operates with a statutory budget that is very limited to what the requirements are, that the mandate, the local law mandates the Commission to do, especially now with the restoration that is required. Which not only, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that PREPA is a government-owned non-profit utility. So typical tools that regulators have to stop imprudent costs to be borne by the ratepayers are not present in the situation that PREPA has, because PREPA has no shareholders. So any costs, being prudent or imprudence, are borne by the ratepayers. So the Energy Commission is we have to be involved in all the restoration, not only if the federal funds are used correctly, but any recovery that is not covered by the federal funds will be covered by the people of Puerto Rico, by the ratepayers. So our role is to make sure that all actions are prudent. With that situation is why the Energy Commission ruled on the rate case order that since we could not disallow costs after the fact, we needed to stop them from being incurred at all. And that's the reason why we requested PREPA to submit the budgets so that we could approve the budgets before they actually started spending the money. There is a challenge of coordinating with the PREPA board. So we asked PREPA, this is something that can be coordinating between the PREPA's board requirement of approving budget, as well as the fiscal oversight board requirement of approving the budget. But we are responsible that the costs are prudent and that rates are just and reasonable for the people of Puerto Rico. So it's a matter of now working all together, being able to put a plan in place. The Commission, as being the regulatory expert in the performance, will take a first look at it, PREPA board will approve it, and then the fiscal oversight can approve it, and then we can move forward.
Let me ask you, Mr. Esco, and I mentioned this just a few minutes ago about the fact that you have a lot of new folks, new regulatory body. From the oversight board perspective, have you seen enough to determine that an emergency manager is necessary now, or should the new leadership be given a chance to implement whatever reforms you feel are appropriate.
So as you know, Madam Chairman, the board took an action and filed in the Title III court to name a chief transformation officer. The court ruled yesterday against us in that action, although we have not yet seen the written judgment, so I can't comment on it in detail. The reason we thought that was necessary, the reason we think that is necessary to deal with PREPA is to bring together these various components, not in any way to interfere with the emergency work that's being done, the recovery work that is absolutely primary, number one, and most important today, but to bring together the medium and long-term aspects of federal funding that has to be brought together with potentially private sector funding to ensure that this sector is finally competitive and providing the kind of low-cost, reliable electricity we all want to see, and bring it together with, as I said earlier, the end of a debt restructuring and the end of the Title III process. Bringing all of those short, medium, and long-term perspectives together was what we thought, and we believe that the Chief Transformation Officer could do. However, the judge's decision is a setback for us, but we are not throwing up our hands. We still, as I said earlier, have the authority to deal with the fiscal plans, and we are in that process, and we will continue to work towards providing the oversight necessary to assure everyone and give everyone confidence that all the funds that are being used will assist us in achieving the goals that we all share.
Do you think that, you describe this as a setback, do you think that this will limit the ability to attract that private investment that you believe is necessary?
I think it is a setback from the perspective of providing the oversight that the Congress has been asking of us and for meeting the lofty expectations of the members. I believe that we will still work with the tools that we have. We will see what happens when we see that written judgment as to what is in the written judgment from the court yesterday. But we will continue to work towards, together with PREPA, the government, and the regulator, who I think is really quite critical, and I can't underline enough, in my previous experience in the energy sector in Ukraine, having an independent regulator that provides private sector with confidence about rate policy and consistency of rate policy, I think is an extremely critical part of attracting private sector capital.